Today, one of the things that we're going to discuss is the concepts of equality, efficiency, and a little bit of social justice. But let's start out with social justice. And one of the people we'll talk about a little today is John Rawls. He said the natural distribution is neither just nor unjust, nor is it unjust that persons are born into society at some particular position. They are simply natural facts. What is just or unjust is the way that institutions deal with these facts. In healthcare, when we think about whether something's equitable or whether there's equality or whether how we relate efficiency, whether what we do is just or unjust, it isn't so much how people were born and whether they were born into poverty or they were born into wealth. It's how we put the policies in place that address the differences to try to make it as just as possible. We've all heard of social justice, but do we understand it more deeply than a term that many people associate with liberal or progressive causes? If we're to explore equity in healthcare policy and how efficiency is balanced against it, then we necessarily must understand the fairness of the process and what is just. Our exploration and understanding will be influenced and must accommodate different views, interests, and experiences. We bring into this discussion our own histories and our own beliefs. It is impossible, as hard as we try, to separate everything that our parents gave to us, did for us, and did to us when we were growing up. All the biases that they shared with us, somewhere in our brains, they're still there. We may, through education and through socialization and working with others, overcome part of our history. But we also need to know that our history affects the way we look at policies. When people consider politics, the one general indicator of whether or not you're going to be a Democrat or a Republican, for example, is what your parents were. And most of us grow up and we think, I'm not going to be my parents, but then we are. And we do it all the time. We'll hear a phrase or an expression that we said, I would never say that to my child. And then we do. We have a thought that runs through our mind that we heard from our parents when we were growing up that we didn't like. But we still become basically who they were if we don't try hard. So a little bit of an overview. We're going to briefly explore procedural justice, redistributive and compensatory justice, and distributive justice, mostly distributive justice. We will then use them to frame our discussion of evidence. Before we do that, we must first understand what is considered evidence. Good evidence, not opinion. All right, so in this class, we're talking about evidence. We're going to try to have less focus on our personal opinions. We all have one, but we need to focus on the evidence. Is the evidence a tool to get to equality and efficiency, or is it something more? I will spend a fair amount of time talking to you then about that evidence. Let's start then with our problem. And one of the things that you're going to be asked to do is to write a problem statement. I want you to seek evidence to both identify a problem and seek solutions for it. Your problem statement should not give the answer. Be very careful when you're writing it. Don't give the answer in your problem statement. One of the big discussions on our discussion board, which you don't have to do because you're here face to face, but the people online must, is discuss a specific policy, and we will talk about this after this, but to discuss a specific policy and how it might have impacted healthcare. Everybody wanted to talk about the ER and about EMTALA, and they went on, but they pretty much were defining their belief of what the answer was into the original part of their discussion, which was too many people use the ER for primary care. And all you have to do is even vaguely mention that to an ER nurse, and you will get an earful, yes. An earful. Well, that and over the weekend, the big discussion was how bad people smell in the ER, and nurses are getting tired of everybody coming in smelling like marijuana. And I was kind of amused. I couldn't resist, even though it was on an open social media group. I said, are you upset because they're using marijuana or because you're at work and not? I did not get an answer to that, but I did get a couple of people that were laughing and thought it was very funny. Is the problem that people really are using the ER for primary care? Have you considered the evidence that answered the question, why? When you write a problem, you have to always remember the why. Why do we think this is a problem? Or why are they doing that? And I bet you everybody in this room has an opinion about why people use the ER for primary care. You need to know that when you are thinking about this, remember that in policy analysis, while it has similarities with research, you're really not a researcher in the same sense. This isn't academic research. You're not going to have months to years to do your literature review. This is on a different time frame. Frequently, when somebody wants a policy answer, yesterday would have been better, but if you can't get it to them yesterday, you're talking about days to weeks to maybe a few months to do something that an academic might spend a year doing. You have to be judicious about the evidence that you are collecting. Your time needs to be spent between thinking about the issue and searching for the data. Policy analysis, unlike research, doesn't come with that time frame. So remember, think first. This will save you time. Here's my example of that. I remember when I was growing up, my mother always made a grocery list when she was going to the grocery store. 4 kids, in tow, needed to know what she was going for, get in, get out before one of us had a meltdown, and only get what she needed because they were living on a limited income, which I didn't realize as a child. I do now. I look back and think, oh my God, how did they do that? But she wanted to get in, get out, and get only what she needed. Because if you didn't have a list, you went in and you had to go up and down all the aisles, and invariably you came home with things you did not need, and you ended up almost always forgetting something that was what you actually went for in the first place. We've all done that, right? Then it makes another trip back, and you never again walk in and just get the one thing. All these little things are set up there to try to tempt you, and it usually works. Right down to the candy at the checkout counter. There's a reason they put it there. When you're looking at your data, think first. You need to know what you're going looking for. If you go out and you try to collect data, you can take yourself down a rat hole. Collect only the data that can be turned into information and to evidence that supports your position. Remember, as the analyst, you're usually being hired to do somebody for this. You don't want to go searching for all the evidence that proves you wrong. You want to ideally find evidence that makes your case if you think it's a good position. Now, if you find something that absolutely proves you wrong, that's important to bring to the attention of the person you're doing this analysis for. data can include that the number of ER visits is rising. In fact, we know that the number of ER visits reached a new high in 2014. It's important when we go back to our problem statement to know that. So it's not wrong when we write that too many people use the ER for primary care, except we made a conclusion that it is too many. Maybe it's not enough. We don't know. The information is data that can help us sort. It should be in logical categories. And so if we consider our ER example, what might the categories be? Well, one could be that we know that as we have an increasing problem with our opiate epidemic, that the number of visits for people having overdoses has increased significantly. That would be one way to categorize it. We know that the increased number of people coming into the ER for traumatic brain injuries is increasing because all of a sudden we realize if somebody gets a concussion playing football, they actually need to be evaluated. Before, we just patted them on the back and threw them back in the game as soon as they were able, in our terms, which resulted in the outcomes we see today in a lot of professional football players. So we learned something. We know that now resulted in increased ER visits. But another way to categorize this might be to look at the time of day and the day of the week. If people are coming between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m., Monday through Friday, or any time pretty much on Saturday and Sunday, maybe what the data would show is people are coming because primary care isn't providing them what they need. In other words, primary care isn't open at the times they could actually go for care, and primary care isn't open on the days they're off. If you're poor, taking a day off, if you're working minimum wage, you probably aren't getting sick leave. So if you take a day off to go to your primary care provider, you may also be losing a day of income. We need to remember how we look at the data and how we categorize it matters. So make sure that you have a good plan before you start searching. Evidence is information that impacts the opinions of people in the position to make decisions. Remember, if you're working as the analyst, you're going to take this and give it to somebody that has the power to make a decision. Or if you're the one that's wanting to lobby your representative, you still are going to give it to someone with the power to make a decision. If ER visits rise after 7 p.m. and are higher on weekends, who do you want to give this to? You might want to think about the associations for emergency physicians, for emergency nurses association, but you might want to also think of sharing this with hospital associations and insurance companies and not-for-profits that may be able to open clinics that are open at the hours people need them. Who you share it with actually matters. I think that that's one of the issues people have to consider when they're thinking about policy. What are the options? It takes you back to your problem statement. You may want to take out the too many people are using the ER. You might want to say, is that really the problem? Or is the problem access to an appropriate level of care? You have to think about that when we're doing it. So I think that there's probably the majority of people have at some point made an ER visit that they questioned whether or not it was appropriate. And there are probably a fair number of people that have not gone to the ER when they should have. I'm allergic to lobster, for example, of all the things to be allergic to, something good. And the last time I accidentally ate it, it was an accident. Somebody said, oh, you should taste this, it's good. And I didn't realize it had lobster sauce on it. And I knew shortly that I had made a big mistake because, well, obvious signs, And so I just went home, took a handful of Benadryl, and thought, if I'll go, it was already late, so I'll just go to sick call first thing in the morning. And I get there, and he looks at me, and he goes, maybe next time you should just go straight to the ER. And I'm like, at that point, yeah, I already had blisters. It was clear I was going to peel. And, you know, it's amazing. Sometimes we make bad decisions about what we choose for care. That's probably not the majority of people that are choosing the way of care. It's probably the exception. But I think we have to look at why, and if we look at the whys, then we might be able to put policies and systems in place that better meet the needs of the people. I put up this piece to say, again, to remind us all to think first. Not every policy decision actually needs data. Sometimes carefully thinking through it and rationally reasoning through a problem is good enough. A lot of people will say, well, one of the things you want to do, sometimes an educated guess is as good as 2 tons of data you can spend a lot of money collecting, because data collection is not cheap. So sometimes an educated guess is good. Now, when I was working for the government, one of the things we refer to as swags. And a swag is not really an educated guess. A swag stood for stupid, wild-ass guess. And that is when somebody comes and says, I need to know this and I need to know it right now. And you're looking at them thinking, that's about 3 months worth of research and you need it tomorrow? That does not get anything except for a stupid wild-ass guess that's based on whatever you can probably find on Google in a hurry. Except that for the most part, we didn't have as much Google then. You need to know the value of the data you're collecting. Is the data likely to change a decision or alter the policy? Would a thoughtful guess be as good? Is the data likely to change the decision? If it's not, why are you spending all of that time getting it? There are certain things that we can think of that it isn't going to matter what the data says. We're probably going to do it anyway. If you were looking at policies relating to children, does it really matter if people say it's cost inefficient to do X for a child if we know that if you do X, you're going to save 80% of the children and 20% will die. But if you do Y, you're going to save 95% of the children, but it's going to cost you a fortune. Really? Who's going to tell the public that 10% of those children are not worth saving? Doesn't matter what your data says. Nobody is going to make that decision. So sometimes you have to know whether the data is actually going to change the decision. We may have a lot of data right now that says that immigration is financially good for a country. But there are probably people in the country that it doesn't matter how much data you show them, it's not going to change how they view immigration. Is data what you really need? And sometimes it isn't the data you need, it's the personal story that people can use to relate to constituents to help them understand why you would do something one way or the other. You are going to have to do reviews of the literature. But as opposed to research where you want all of this primary source stuff, the original piece of research, not somebody else's literature review, in policy analysis, if you can find that literature review somebody already did, that's better, because it's going to save you a lot of time. And remember, time is your enemy. You only have so much of it, and the time you're using costs you money, and it costs your client money. See what's out there. You need to know the literature before you go talking to people, and one of the steps is talking to people that can inform your policy. You'll eventually talk to subject matter experts and other people, but you don't want to go talk to them until you've read the literature. And certainly if that person that you're interested in speaking to is an expert and they've written a lot on the topic, you want to make sure that you've read what they've published. You don't want to show up knowing that they already wrote a paper that explained everything that you just asked them, and you've now taken up an hour of my time to find out what you could have read in this paper in 15 minutes. You don't want to do that. So make sure that you go in well educated. The other piece of advice on talking to people, start with and I hate to put it this way, but the least important people first, and work your way up so the most important people you talk to at the end. And you want to do that so that you really aren't wasting their time. Remember that when you go in and you talk to people, the higher up the food chain you get, the more well-known the person is, the more powerful the person is, the more they are a true expert, probably the busier they are. So their time is valuable. Again, if they've written it, read it. Now, you may say to some people, well, isn't that just kind of sucking up? Yes, it is, but usually people have egos. And even if you need to stroke their ego to get them to give you what you need, so be it, because one day you hope to be that person too. And you won't get there if you go in unprepared. You have to build credibility and respect. And as I just said, in building credibility and respect, you do that by being careful with people's time, making sure you know the topic when you go in, and only asking the questions you need to ask. Don't wing it. When you go in to ask somebody questions, you need to go with the list of questions and the information you need. It needs to be written down, and you need to go in, ask your questions, and when you're done, get out. Don't take up anybody's time. The last question should always be, is there anybody else you think I should talk to? Always, always, always. That should be your very last question. And then you thank them for their time. Nobody is going to be upset if you scheduled a 30-minute meeting and you only took 20 minutes and you ended and left. But you do not want to run over. You need to be getting up to get out that door. Even if you don't have absolutely everything you need, you do not want to be late, because they will remember if you need them again in the future. When it comes to analyzing, at some point you must stop collecting data. You have to analyze what you got. Documents will always lead to more documents. Documents will lead to people. People will lead to people, and you will have information that is going everywhere. You will have first-hand information and second-hand, so-and-so told me that. You need to always make sure that the information is accurate. But remember, you can go down rat holes, especially in search engines. Whether it be a Google search engine or it's PubMed. You know how when you search on PubMed, you know the article you're interested in finding and the topic, and you put that, and it gives you this nice little list down the right side of similar articles, and you click on one, and 2 hours later, you will realize that you are reading articles that have nothing to do with what you started looking for. Yes, that first one was similar, and this one was similar to the last one, but it is not similar at all to what you started looking for. But it was interesting, so you kept on going. Be careful not to do that. It's kind of, again, like going to the grocery store without your shopping list. Don't do that. You don't want to just window shop for information. Make sure that you improve your understanding. This is not research in the sense that Your PhD students will be experiencing research for their dissertation. This is research for policy analysis, and it is a little different. It is not new knowledge or meant to help you reach personal enlightenment. Okay? That's not your goal. Your goal is a broad approximation of the truth. You are not the sole arbiter of the truth, nor is the person that you're doing this for. So just try to keep on track. Remember, the more thinking you do up front before you start collecting data, the better off you will be. Critically analyze your sources. So there are good sources and there are bad sources. There are places you should cite, you can always cite, and places you should cite with caution. When you collect information from the literature, stakeholders, policymakers, and other sources, you need to critically evaluate it. You will need to turn it into coherent review that identifies strengths, weaknesses, and themes. Think about your literature. Peer-reviewed literature is the best. You want evidence-based. You want research data. But remember, every peer-reviewed journal is not equal. There are a lot of journals now that say they're peer-reviewed that are trash. Be careful what you're looking at. There is trusted media and media that is verging on tabloid gossip. Some of the channels that say they are news are really not news. I would say Fox News is rarely actually true or accurate news. It is not the only one. Every once in a while, I watch something on MSNBC and I'm just looking at it and thinking, how could you possibly say such a thing? You have to know that is not true. Anybody that spent 5 minutes on Google or 5 minutes on PubMed would know that what you just said was not true or accurate. One of the topics for the policy analysis paper is abortion and contraceptive use. Don't cite LifeSite News. Don't do it. They frequently put out things that are just salacious and meant to offend the senses. And turn out, and the science is horrible. Blogs, one of our favorite things. I love reading blogs. I subscribe to so many. I would never, ever, I wouldn't even cite my own blog, right? Blogs are our opinions. They're the things that we're passionate about, but they're not always fact-based. So I really wouldn't cite blogs. Here's my exception to things that a lot of people say cite that I'm fine with. I actually like Wikipedia. I think that they do a better job right now of peer reviewing than a lot of the journals that are just out there to make money. Wikipedia has changed what it used to be. And if you look at the criteria to be somebody that writes on Wikipedia or somebody that peer reviews on Wikipedia, they're pretty substantial. You should take a look at them sometimes. And certainly, it is a great place to go to find links to other sources. It is a good first source to help you find other sources. Sure.
How do you determine that Fox News versus MSNBC is one right versus the other?
I think that so I don't think it's a good thing for people to take all their news from TV news shows, to the 24-hour news cycle. When you see this, a lot of them are really just giving commentary. They're not going out and searching out facts. They're just reading a script somebody gave them. A lot of them are interviews with people who clearly have an agenda. I think both of them give you an idea of what people are thinking on both sides of an issue, but I don't think they are not like the print media. So if you look at the big papers, even ours, the St. Louis Review, or you look at the Washington Times or the New York Times or The Los Angeles, I can't remember what the Los Angeles paper is. I think it's also the Times. If you look at these big papers, they actually have people that fact check the articles. So while every once in a while anybody's going to get it wrong, anybody's going to every once in a while make a mistake, you're going to do your research, and every once in a while, to the best you try, you're going to pull a source that turns out to either have been right at one point and now been wrong, or just be a bad source that you believed and cited and it was wrong. Happens in peer-reviewed journals. People get things through all the time that have errors in them. It happens. But there are some places that do it on a regular basis, right? I mean, so you have to go and take that, and then you have to look at what they said, and sometimes you need to do a little bit of research on your own, which maybe is simple as a Google search, but it may require going to the peer-reviewed literature and seeing what's actually written there, or going to government websites. Government websites may not tell us what we want to hear, but they usually do tell us the truth. I mean, they usually are at least honest about it. Look at other places. Subject matter experts are not all created equal. I wrote a paper once, Subject Matter Experts, Fact or Fiction, and when I was working for HHS and got really frustrated with some of the people on the news that I saw that were saying they were subject matter experts. They were not. They were self-proclaimed subject matter experts, but they were not nationally recognized experts. Stick to the nationally recognized experts. There's activists, policymakers, and politicians. Be careful about the activists. They have agendas, and they tend to tell one side of the story, the side that supports their cause. And then there are policy institutes, FFRDCs, which are federally funded research and development centers, which means that they do research and policy analysis and things like that for the government, but they don't sell a product. Somebody else, if they say this is what you do, somebody else implements it so that the bias is taken out of what they do. There are organizations like MITRE and RAND. And so when you see stuff from a MITRE or a RAND, you can pretty much trust it. And then there's all kinds of think tanks, policy institutes galore on all spectrums. And if you just search policy institutes, or if you look in the book that you're reading by Cartwright, you will find a list of legitimate think tanks and policy institutes that really are good sources. The one thing you find in policy research is rarely is the question you're asking new. Somebody has thought it and asked it before. It's better if you can find what people have done before and to try to use it to your advantage. Now this takes us back to the question of equity and inequality and efficiency. We focus on distributive conflict. So equality is our goal. It's not always possible to have perfect equality. Who gets to decide what's a fair distribution? For the most part, we know that we have a democratic system of government where we elect people that then make the decisions about distribution. In a sense, though, we're making some of our decisions ourselves because we elected these people, correct? Go back and remember the story of the cake. Is an equal slice always equal? As Deborah Stone pointed out, there is a paradox in distributive problems. Equality often means inequality, and equal treatment often means unequal treatment. Equal isn't always equal. And I think we've all seen the graphic of the stair steps and the people standing on them, and you get the little kid that if you give them the same size stair as the adult, they can't even see over the fence. equal isn't always equal. It doesn't get everyone to the same place. So it depends on how you're defining things, what you come up with. There are dimensions of equality, and we'll discuss a few of these. First of all, you need to know who is the community. For everyone that thinks the framers of our Constitution were these wonderful, brilliant, and wise men that could foresee the future, they counted slaves as 3/4 of a person. So if you want to say that this document is the model of equality, and not necessarily so. So you can't go back and say, well, the Constitution says so, therefore it is. Not necessarily. There were flaws, and there still are flaws. Remember, we had the suffragettes for a reason. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution gave women the right to vote. It has not always been perfect. So what are some other examples? Any other examples that you can think of? Roe v. Wade.
Roe v. Wade, or what's the other one that the integration of blacks into schools?
Brown versus the Board of Education, separate but equal.
Thought were right, but kind of aren't.
And so those are two examples of where we're saying equal isn't always equal. They said separate but equal, and the Supreme Court said there's no such thing as separate but equal, essentially, because while you were separate, certainly the distribution was not equal. Roe v. Wade basically said there is not equality, that the woman, living, breathing woman, right supersedes the rights of the fetus. So you have to decide, is the fetus life? And if it is, then we're saying, no, there's not equality there. That one has more rights than the other. Those are actually both very good examples of when equality isn't always equality. Other dimensions of equality include merit. We talk about merit in terms of knowledge and talent. What's one of our most common things that's merit-based? Scholarships, even admission into programs of education. Whether or not you got into a doctoral program or a master's program or even your bachelor's degree program was largely merit-based. So that is one that focuses on the recipients. Rank is another one that focuses on recipients. So in the military, there are ranks. I was always amused when you went to the National Naval Medical Center, if you had a star on your shoulder, you got no wait time, you got somebody that walked you through your visits, you got all kinds of special treatment based on your rank. If you were what they call a butter bar, a brand new officer, you didn't get squat. You got nothing. If you went to the commissary to shop, there were special parking places for the sergeant major, for high-ranking officers, and for pregnant women. Pregnant women, they get all kinds of benefits. And they do in society. What grocery store have you been to recently that doesn't have a parking place that's reserved for pregnant women? Almost all of them have signs up. That's their decision. Now, the law, accessible parking places are the law. The pregnant women one is just a benefit for pregnant women. Others are groups. Some are privileged. Veterans are a good example of a privileged group. We don't ask if a veteran was a good military, if they were a good soldier or Marine. There are some really horrendously bad ones, by the way. We don't ask if it was a good officer or a bad officer. There are some really bad officers. But they all get the same privileged status as a veteran. We give that group privilege. And sometimes in opposition to the advantages given that are based on merit. So even a bad officer that was a bad military officer that got out, but managed to get out without being in trouble, they get preference in hiring for many jobs. Even if they were a horrendous officer, they're going to get. So you have to remember that there are privileged groups, and this is just an example of a privileged group. Then there's the dimensions of equality that are based on items. So boundaries, need-based. Examples include welfare and tax policy. Welfare is need-based, and some of our tax policies are. We do not have people who are in poverty pay as much in taxes as we have people who are wealthy. And while we can argue about what percentage of income they're paying, if I make $1 million and I'm paying 10%, and even if I were poor and I were paying 10%, it's a lot more money. But we have distributions in how we assign tax policy. And then there's the other ones that are process-oriented about equality. So whether something's competition or a lottery or a vote, right? A lottery is the thing that we hear about immigration policy. They want to do away with the lottery system, which basically says they pull your name out of a hat for all practical purposes. The lottery is kind of, well, here's the best example. A lot of states have lotteries. The money from the lottery goes to things like to pay for education. So essentially, you get a bunch of people who are predominantly poor that go and buy their lottery tickets for the chance to be rich. It's basically a tax on the poor that people do voluntarily because of the hope of being rich.
Yeah, that sounds really good.
Yeah, well.
Lotteries are interesting because if you do them, if you set them up as like statistical problems, it's like actually it's a net loss for everybody. Even though one person, it's like just a net loss distributed over a lot of people.
Yes. Yeah, there you go. We could get rich if we started our own lottery.
Just grab this stuff and we'll all pull in some money and then start selling tickets.
Okay, so we have competition and we have voting, and we all know about competition. There are many things that we compete in life, so I'm not going to spend any time on those. Efficiency is all about getting the most for the least. We all want efficiency, but who gets the benefits and who bears the burdens of that efficiency? I think we talk about efficiency in the healthcare system. We reward efficiency, but sometimes what we're rewarding is, here's a good example. We reward people that see more patients and they do a better job of coding their patients. Who does that reward? It rewards the insurance company. It rewards the provider that just got money. It sure doesn't reward the person that was sick, who kind of got, I mean, there is no reward there for them. They may have gotten upcoded for something because they could, so their insurance company paid more money, and they got a shorter visit that they would have probably gotten otherwise because the provider wanted that bonus. So efficient for who is always an important question. In theory, markets are efficient because people would not make a trade-off that makes them worse off. Of course, now we all know that there are some problems with that theory. It would require that we have equal knowledge, accurate information, and honest markets as a beginning point. So what are some of the assumptions that for the market to maximize social welfare? Rationality is one of them. People will maximize their self-interest, but what happens when their self-interest is manipulated? How many people have eaten how much food from McDonald's or Popeyes? One of my favorite things that sinful foods I should not eat. There's enough calories in one meal for a whole day. Now, you know, if I go and just totally give in to everything in me telling me I must have fried chicken, then I am not only going to eat one meal that day, right? We have to keep in mind that there are all these temptations in life, and there are people trying to sell us things. Do you really need 5 pairs of tennis shoes? No, but there's ads on TV that tell us we do. We can be manipulated by markets. For everybody to truly act in their self-interest, they have to have full information. But they also have to have the mental capabilities to understand the information they're given. We can go back to our ER example. Yes, going to the ER may not be the best choice. But what if you don't have all the information? There's a difference between a person that has a common cold and a person that has the flu. But how many people truly don't understand if they have a common cold or they have the flu? They don't feel good, they're getting sick. They go to the ER and it's a common cold, and the nurses and the docs get all ticked off at them. There's the person that has the flu, usually the young male, that decides that they are not going to the ER because they can tough it out, and they are found dead in their bed because they had the flu and didn't go to get care, and consequently the flu does kill people every year. It matters that you are educated enough to know the difference. So there is an education gap between the doctors and the nurses and the patients. Yeah.
Well, and I even had like some equipment that I had stolen from my job. Like I had a thrombolytic patch, but I was like, what if it's, it's bleeding a lot? I was like, what if it's deeper than
Yeah, all that stuff that goes home in our pockets with us that you're just like, I have alcohol pads that dried out years ago that you stick in your pockets and then you end up home with them.
If I had skin flu, we wouldn't have gone, but I didn't.
Right, exactly. So there are other things, though, that we need to think about. There are the times that the government has to make a decision, those external things that are good for the social welfare of all. Sometimes you need to make policies that prevent harm to the greater community, even though they may benefit some or may benefit many. We know that there are things that are cheaper, but they are bad for us. And there was a time when there was lead and gas. Now, it cost them more money to have unleaded gas, but guess what? We're all better off as a result. I always laugh when people talk about clean coal. There's no such thing, people. It's nasty. It's just nasty. And when you burn it, it's bad for you. And when you breathe it, it's bad for you. So there are things that the government needs to regulate. There are chemicals that there are pesticides that the government has to take out because they are harmful to the environment. But going back to lead in paint, for example. We don't have lead in paint now because children ate the paint chips and got lead poisoning because the lead paint dust in their house basically caused a lot of harmful effects. We now have EPA regulations about lead. And if you ever sell your house, it'll probably, and it's old, before 1978, it'll probably be tested for lead, correct? There are things that even though we may have wanted them, we have governments that intervene, even though they sold and made somebody a lot of money because they're harmful. You have policies that are conflicting, and you have priorities that are conflicting. As healthcare providers, frequently our priority is the best interest of the patient. But there is a lot of pressure by administrators and by insurance companies and others that basically say the bottom line. Financial fee, it has to be financially a wise decision to make, which takes us back to how much responsibility does a person have. And I think one of the things we understand when we're looking through policy is that people do need to weigh personal responsibility against what happens if we don't do that. So one of the reasons you want a copay is to get people to not overuse the medical system. That is one of the reasons you have a copay. It's why we have tax on cigarettes, besides the fact that it makes us a lot of money off people that clearly have a horrible addiction to them. But it basically is to discourage use. Now, do we just want to, in the Affordable Care Act, one of the things it did is preventive care has no deductible. So if you go in to get some of the preventative care, there isn't that deductible associated with it. But there is for everything else, and part of that is to keep us from overusing the system. One of the things you see a lot of in the literature is we do use the system a lot for things that we might necessarily not have to use it for. Public goods. Would individuals voluntarily pay for some of the things? How many of us would pay for the police if we had to ante up to pay our share and it was a choice? Yeah, that person that gives me speeding tickets, probably not. Fire, hospitals, the military. A lot of people would not voluntarily pay for these things. So there are things that the market does not work for. I would argue the market really does not work well with healthcare because we can't choose not to get healthcare. Especially if we have a serious illness or a broken bone, it really isn't a choice. So it doesn't work so well. And then competition assumes that competition improves efficiency and makes everyone better off. And sometimes competition just runs up prices. Education is a great example. Because of competition, we spend how many hundreds of millions of dollars across the country, or billions maybe even, to build these huge, beautiful rec centers for students and swimming pools with every dorm. And then we complain that the cost of education is going up. Well, we do that because the students go and visit the college that had these things, and that's where they want to go. Why do you have a football team at every school? Because athletic teams recruit students, even though for most schools, they're hugely expensive. There are the exceptions, the Big Ten schools. They make money off their sports, but most schools don't. Most schools, that costs them money. So let's return to social justice real quick. How do we ensure the most just society? There's no perfect theory. In your book, it discussed several: libertarianism, utilitarianism, justice of fairness, which is Rawls, compatibilities approach, which is Amartya Sen, and Marxism, although it's a different version of Marxism than what a lot of people know. And does it then matter if you can put your views into one of these theories? I don't think you necessarily have to put it in exactly into one of these theories, but I think it is a good idea that you have a theoretical framework that you buy into and that you use when you're making policy, because it gives you almost a checklist of saying, does it do 1, 2, 3, and 4? How does it? Otherwise, you tend to have a haphazard approach. This goes back to making your list before you start. So let's think about some socially optimal approaches. One that nursing is familiar with, because the ANA used it for years and years, was utilitarianism, which is the sum of the utilities for all people. And utilitarianism is the ethical theory advanced by Jeremy Bentham. Both James and Mill and others, that answers all questions of what to do, what to admire, how to live in terms of maximizing utility or happiness. As well as the ethical theory, utilitarianism is, in effect, the view of life presupposed in most modern political and economic planning, when it is supposed that the happiness is measured in economic terms. There are many ways to look at this and to think about it. It's interesting when you think about people measuring happiness in economic terms. Are we better off or are we worse off? And yet Rawls brought kind of new attention to political theory when he wrote The Theory of Justice. Rawls considers the basic institution of a society that could be chosen by rational people under conditions that ensure impartiality. He refers to it as a veil of ignorance, so that they are not able to have selfish considerations or ones that favor a particular kind of person. He believes that a basic framework of liberties and a concern for the least well-off would characterize any society which it would be rational to choose. So Rawls tried to form an alternative to utilitarianism. Basically, the idea is that social justice is intended to be a political theory of social justice. It is a moral conception of justice that applies to political, social, and economic institutions rather than the individual. And he had two essential principles, which were either a person is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with similar liberties for others, and two, that social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are, one, reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage, and two, attached to positions and offices open to all. To simplify his position assumes that the chief primary goods at the disposition of society are rights and liberties, powers and opportunities, incomes and wealth. They are social primary goods. So our primary goods are such things as health and intelligence and natural goods. So that is one way to conceptualize it. That's a second way. As analysts, we have to think about the approach. So let's go back to some of the examples that we might have had earlier, like the ER visits. Disasters work really well as an example. Policy analysts face trade-offs between efficiency and other values. We know that utility, happiness, is subjective. What makes me happy may not make you happy. And social welfare function must be specified. So what are we saying these functions are? Are they wealth? Are they income? Are they intelligence? Is it education? Is it health? What is it? Analysts tend to focus on immediate consequences so they can manage the burdens, but fail to consider the long-term consequences. Now, this leads us into the discussion for this week, which is, what is the status of the U.S. healthcare system, And is it more equitable and efficient than it has been historically? Is there one policy change that has made healthcare more or less equitable or efficient? So when you consider this, if you consider the process that resulted in our current system, would you say that it more closely aligns with one theory of social justice or another? And I think that today, that is where we are going to think about what's next. And we will move on from here to our discussion section.